They laughed when he walked out. A billionaire CEO, a room full of executives in expensive suits, and one quiet maintenance worker who had just been told to fulfill orders or get out. He chose to get out. They thought that was the end of him. It wasn't. What happened next shook an entire company to its foundation and exposed a conspiracy that could have cost hundreds of families everything they had. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city or country in the comments. I finna see how far this story travels. Let's get into it. The alarm went off at 5:15, same as every morning. Grant Calloway didn't slam it, didn't groan. He just reached over, pressed the button, and lay there for about 10 seconds staring at the water stain on his bedroom ceiling, the one shaped vaguely like a boot, before swinging his legs over the side of the bed and planting both feet on the cold floor. That was the ritual. 10 seconds of stillness, then move. He'd learned it after Elena died. In those first weeks without her, the mornings had been the worst part. The grief itself, which came in waves throughout the day and hit hardest around dinner time when there were 2 plates on the table instead of 3. The mornings were brutal because sleep was the only real escape, and waking up meant doing it all over again. So he'd built the ritual. 10 seconds. Feet on the floor. 4 years later, it still worked. Mostly. He padded down the hallway in his socks, stopping at Lily's door. It was cracked open the way she liked it. She was 8 years old and still convinced that something lived in her closet, a fact she'd never admit out loud, but which explained why she always left the hall light on and kept her door at exactly 45 degrees. Grant had stopped arguing about the electricity bill. He pushed the door open gently. Lily was curled on her side, one arm wrapped around a stuffed elephant named Gerald that had lost most of its stuffing and one of its button eyes. Her dark hair was a spectacular mess across the pillow. Watched her sleep for about 3 seconds. No longer. Any more than that, and it started to feel like something he couldn't name, some mix of gratitude and grief and pure uncomplicated love that was too big for 5:15 in the morning. He went downstairs and made coffee. The drive to Redwood Forge took 22 minutes when traffic was normal. Grant had done it so many times that his hands knew the turns before his brain registered them. He pulled into the employee lot at 6:40, so nodded to the security guard at the gate, a retired cop named Mickey who'd been there longer than half the machines inside, and walked across the cracked asphalt toward the maintenance entrance. Redwood Forge Industries sat on the eastern edge of the county, a sprawling industrial complex that had been built in pieces over 60 years. The original structure, a squat, brick-fronted building with narrow windows, was visible at the center, so surrounded by newer additions in corrugated steel and poured concrete. The whole thing covered roughly 40 acres of flat land, not counting the back property that everyone had long since stopped thinking about. The factory made precision components, structural brackets, pressure housings, custom fittings for STs for aerospace and heavy equipment manufacturers. It wasn't glamorous work. It was loud and hot and required a specific kind of person, the kind who didn't need excitement but needed to know they were doing something real. Grant had been doing it for 17 years. He hadn't planned to stay this long. He'd taken the job when he was 15 and needed money, and Redwood Forge was hiring summer help. Then he'd come back at 17. And again after his first year of community college, when the tuition money ran out. The time he was 23, he knew every system in the building. The hydraulic lines, the pressure seals, the electrical grid, the ventilation, the water cooling loops. He knew which machines had bad habits and what those habits sounded like before anything actually broke. His official title was Maintenance Specialist 3. In practice, he was the person people called when something went wrong at 2 in the morning, and the shift supervisor was panicking. He never got extra pay for the 2 a.m. calls. He'd stopped expecting it. The morning started normal enough. Grant ran his usual check on line 3, which had been making an irregular clicking sound for the past week, to the kind of sound that most people could tune out, but that sat in Grant's ear like a splinter. He'd traced it to a worn bearing housing near the secondary drive shaft and had already submitted the repair request twice. Twice it had been approved and then quietly deprioritized when production schedules shifted. He made a note in his log. Third submission. Added photographs this time. By 8:30, he was in the sub-basement checking the pressure readings on line 4. Line 4 was the oldest continuous production line in the facility. It had been upgraded twice in the past decade, but the upgrades were patchwork new digital controls bolted onto infrastructure that had been designed for a different era. The pressure seals in the main junction assembly were the original specifications. They'd been rated for a maximum of 240 psi under normal operating conditions. For the past 6 weeks, production on Line 4 had been running at 218, close enough to the limit that Grant had started sleeping badly. 3 weeks ago, management had ordered the line pushed to 231. Grant had written his first warning. 2 weeks ago, the order came down to push it to 238. Grant had written his second warning, more detailed this time. He'd included the seal specifications, the age of the equipment, the thermal variance data he'd been collecting for months. He'd flagged the pressure differential that built up during the morning warm-up cycle, which pushed readings temporarily above the steady-state numbers. But he had responded. Last week, the order had come to push Line 4 to 244. Grant had gone to Preston Vale's office in person. Preston Vale had been COO of Redwood Forge for 3 years. He was 51 years old, wore his shirts a size too small to suggest he was still built like the college athlete he'd been 30 years ago, and had the particular brand of confidence that came from never having been seriously wrong about anything important, or at least from never having admitted it. His office was on the 3rd floor of the admin building, with a view of the main floor that he almost never used. The windows were there for optics. Grant had knocked on the open door. Preston was on the phone. He'd held up one finger without looking up the universal signal for "I see you and you are not my priority," and finished his call 2 minutes later. Calloway. He'd set the phone down. "What is it?" Grant had laid the maintenance report on his desk. "Line 4. I need 5 minutes." Preston had looked at the report the way people look at junk mail. "I've seen your notes." "Then you know what I'm concerned about." You're concerned." Preston had leaned back in his chair. "I also know that this line has been running for 60 years, and it hasn't blown up yet. It hasn't been pushed to 244 yet. The specs say 240. The specs say maximum, not recommended operating range." Grant had held eye contact, which he could feel Preston didn't love. "There's a difference." Preston had looked at him for a long moment. "The acquisition audit is in 6 weeks. We need production numbers that reflect what this facility is capable of." "That's not a request. I understand that. I'm telling you the seals on Line 4 are not capable of sustained operation at 244, reliably. Not with the thermal variance we're seeing in the morning cycle." Preston had picked up his phone again. "I'll take it under advisement." That was the last real conversation they had. Grant had submitted the 3rd written warning the following morning. He'd sent it to Preston's email with a read receipt. The receipt showed it had been opened at 9:17 a. Response came. The board meeting was held on a Thursday afternoon in the main conference room on the 4th floor of the admin building, a glass-walled room that had been renovated 2 years ago when Camille Waverly had taken over as CEO. Before the renovation, it had been a perfectly functional room. After, it had floor-to-ceiling windows, a table that could seat 20, and chairs that cost more than Grant's monthly mortgage payment. He'd been summoned. That was the word people used afterward. Summoned. In truth, Preston had sent a terse email that morning. "Board wants to review Line 4 concerns directly. Be there at 2. Grant had rearranged his afternoon schedule, arranged for Lily's after-school pickup with his neighbor, Mrs. Pacheco, and put on the only button-down shirt he kept at the factory for emergencies. He walked into the conference room at 2 o'clock, exactly. There were 14 people around the table. Board members, senior management, 2 attorneys, some from finance, who Grant had never seen before. Preston Vale was at the far end, his expression neutral in that deliberate way that isn't actually neutral. And at the head of the table, directly in front of the windows with the afternoon sun hitting her at an angle that seemed almost staged, was Camille Waverly. Grant had seen her before, obviously. She was 30 years old and had been on the cover of 3 business magazines in the past year alone. She'd inherited controlling interest in Redwood Forge from her father, Marcus Waverly, who had died 14 months ago of a heart attack in his own office, yet 2 floors below where Grant was standing. Marcus had built the company over 40 years. Camille had stepped in and spent the first 6 months demonstrating aggressively that she was not going to be managed by the people who'd expected to manage her. She had that quality some people had, where you were aware of her before she spoke. Dark hair pulled back, good suit, eyes that moved around a room and registered everything. She looked at Grant when he came in. Just briefly, the way you'd look at something, and then file it. Grant took the only open chair, which was near the middle of the table and slightly away from the main cluster of executives. He set his folder on the table. Preston opened the meeting. He described at some length the production requirements for the acquisition audit and the timeline constraints and the confidence the senior team had in the facility's capability. He used phrases like robust operating parameters and engineering conservatism and risk-adjusted performance benchmarks. Grant listened and watched the board members nodding along and felt something go quiet in his chest. Then Preston said, "We do have one team member who has raised some concerns, and since we believe in transparency, we wanted to address those here directly." He gestured toward Grant. "Calloway, you want to take us through what you've been worried about?" Grant opened his folder. He'd brought printed copies of all 3 warnings, the pressure data, the seal specifications, and a 2-page summary he'd put together the night before at his kitchen table after Lily went to bed. He talked for 8 minutes. He was not a natural public speaker. He knew that. His voice didn't have the smooth, rolling quality of someone who'd done executive presentations. But he knew the numbers, and he knew what they meant, and he explained it plainly. When he finished, the room was quiet for about 4 seconds. One of the board members, an older man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, said, "Is this about liability exposure? Are you trying to create a paper trail?" Grant looked at him. "I'm trying to make sure the people on that floor don't get hurt." Board member, "How long have you been in maintenance?" 17 years. And has line 4 ever failed catastrophically in 17 years? Because it's never been pushed to these pressures in sustained operation before. The same board member glanced at Preston. Grant saw the glance. He understood what it meant. Preston stepped back in. "Calloway, I appreciate you bringing your concerns forward. We've had our engineering consultants review the specifications." "Which consultants?" Grant asked. A brief pause. "I'm sorry? Which engineering consultants reviewed the specifications?" "I'd like to see the report." Preston's expression didn't change, exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted. "That information is handled through the executive team." I asked a direct question. "Which consultants?" It got very quiet. Camille Waverly had not said anything yet. She'd been sitting at the head of the table with her hands folded, watching. She unfolded her hands and set them flat on the table. "Mr. Calloway." Her voice was precise, not unkind, but with no warmth in it. "We have an acquisition closing in 6 weeks. The entire future of this facility depends on presenting viable production numbers. What you're proposing rolling back line 4 to lower pressure ranges would cost us 7 to 9% of projected output at exactly the wrong moment." "I understand that," Grant said. "Do you understand what happens if this deal falls through? The jobs, the pensions, the families depending on this company? With respect, I understand it better than most people in this room. My concerns aren't about the deal. They're about the equipment." Looked at him steadily. "We need line 4 running at full capacity. Is not negotiable. Then at minimum, the morning warm-up protocol needs to be adjusted. The thermal variance during..." She said his name the same way she'd said it the first time. The conversation was over. He just hadn't accepted it yet. "This has been reviewed. The decision has been made. I need to know whether you can support that decision or not." Grant looked at her. He thought very briefly about Lily asleep in her room with Gerald the one-eyed elephant. He thought about Mrs. Chen on the floor, who'd been working line 4 for 12 years and whose youngest daughter had just started college. He thought about his mortgage. "I can't support a decision that I believe puts workers at risk," he said. "That's not something I'm able to do." The room got very quiet again. Cam looked at him for a moment. Something moved across her face, just briefly, that might have been surprise, or might have been something else. Then it was gone. "Then I need you to follow this directive, or I need you to submit your resignation." It was very clearly not an invitation to negotiate. Grant looked around the table. Nobody met his eyes. Preston Vale was studying a spot on this table, 2 feet in front of him. The board members were looking at their folders or their phones. The attorney nearest the window had tilted his chair slightly away, as if he'd decided he was a bystander. Grant looked back at Camille Waverly. He closed his laptop. "Then I'm leaving." He gathered his folder. He pushed his chair back. The chair made a scraping sound on the floor that was very loud in the silence. He walked to the door. Behind him, someone laughed softly. It wasn't cruel, exactly. It was the laughter of people who had just watched something predictable happen. Grant recognized the sound. He'd heard it before in other contexts. The sound of people who assumed they already knew how the story ended. He didn't turn around. He picked Lily up from school himself that afternoon. Mrs. Pacheco had been happy enough to cancel when he'd texted that he'd handle it. Lily came out through the front doors with a backpack, half-zipped and a drawing in her hand. She always had a drawing, and spotted him leaning against the car. Her face did the thing it did sometimes, where it went from regular 8-year-old face to something unguarded and purely glad. She ran across the sidewalk and crashed into him at full speed, and he caught her and held on. "You're here," she said into his shoulder. "I'm here." She pulled back and looked at him. She had Elena's eyes, that particular shade of brown that caught light in a specific way. She was also, unfortunately, very perceptive for an 8-year-old. She looked at his face the way she looked at things she was trying to solve. "Something happened," she said. "I'll tell you at home." He did. He sat her down at the kitchen table with a glass of apple juice and her after-school crackers, and he told her in the simple, accurate terms that worked with Lily what had happened. He told his boss that the machine was dangerous and could hurt people. His boss had said to do it anyway, and he'd said no, and he'd left. Lily ate a cracker and thought about it. "Because people could get hurt," she said. "Real people, like the people you work with, like Mrs. Chen, like Hector, like 50 other people on that floor." She was quiet for another moment. Was it scary? Saying no? Grant thought about it. About the room, the silence, the laughter he'd heard when he walked out. "No. A little bit, yeah. But you did it anyway, yeah." Lily finished her juice. She looked at him with that unguarded, direct look she sometimes had. "Then you did the right thing, Dad." Grant nodded. He didn't say anything. He was afraid that if he tried to speak at that exact moment, his voice was going to do something embarrassing. He made dinner, spaghetti, because it was a Thursday, and Thursday was spaghetti. Yuck it. While it cooked, he stood at the stove and thought about the mortgage payment due in 19 days, and whether his savings could cover 2 months or 3, and whether there was anyone he could call about consulting work. He didn't think about the conference room. He didn't think about the laughter. What he thought about, as the water came to boil and Lily sat at the table, behind him drawing something new, was line 4. He thought about the pressure readings, the thermal variance data, the age of those seals. He thought about how long it would take, running at 244 psi for the stress on those cells to reach the point where the material started to give. He did the math again in his head, the way he'd done it a dozen times. The answer kept coming up the same. Not if, when. 3 days later, Grant was at the kitchen sink doing the breakfast dishes when his phone rang. It was Hector Salazar. Hector was the floor supervisor on line 4. He was 53 years old, built like a man who had spent 30 years doing physical work, and had the particular calm of someone who'd seen enough emergencies that they'd stopped looking like emergencies and started looking like problems to solve. He never called this early. Grant picked up. "You need to turn on the news," Hector said. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Grant dried his hands on the dish towel and walked to the living room. He turned on the TV. The local news channel had aerial footage. It took him a moment to orient himself, and then he recognized the roofline of the admin building and the parking lot layout, and his stomach dropped. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Industrial incident at Redwood Forge, no injuries reported." "Hector," Grant said. "Line 4, Hector said. "The main junction seal started leaking at 0640. I shut the whole system down before it went." Grant a pause. "Another 10 minutes and I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe a lot of people going to the hospital." Grant sat down on the couch. On the TV, a reporter was standing in the Redwood Forge parking lot with the building behind her. "You shut it down yourself?" Grant asked. "Soon as I saw the pressure spike on the board. I didn't wait for authorization. Another pause. Figured that was what you would have done. Grant didn't say anything for a moment. You're okay? He asked. Everyone's okay. Hector was quiet. You warned them. 3 times you told them. I know. They're going to say it was a coincidence. Operator error. Or something. Maybe, Grant said. What are you going to do? Grant looked at the TV. Reporter was interviewing a company spokesperson who was using words like precautionary and isolated and under control. The spokesperson was a man Grant didn't recognize, which probably meant he'd been brought in specifically for this. No yet, Grant said. Right now I'm going to pour myself a cup of coffee and make sure my daughter eats her breakfast. He hung up. He sat for a moment longer in the quiet living room. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something. The refrigerator hummed. Then he got up, went to the kitchen, and called up the stairs. Breakfast. He heard the thump of her feet hitting the floor. He poured the coffee. He scrambled the eggs. He set the table. Some things he had learned you kept doing regardless of what else was falling apart. You made breakfast. You got your kid to school. You put one foot in front of the other and you trusted that the next step would appear. What he didn't know yet, what none of them knew that morning was that, across town, in a downtown office building, a woman named Camille Waverly was sitting at her desk staring at a maintenance report she hadn't seen before. 3 of them, actually, all written by Grant Calloway, all stamped as received by Preston Vale's office. None of them ever forwarded to her. She read the first one, then the second, then the third. Then she sat very still for a long time. Her coffee went cold. Camille Waverly had not slept. Not properly. She'd gone home at 11, lain down on top of her bed, still wearing most of her clothes, and stared at the ceiling until somewhere around 2 in the morning when she finally drifted into something shallow and restless that technically qualified as sleep, but didn't do much for her. By 5:30, she was back at her desk. The 3 maintenance reports were still there. She'd printed them the night before, which was something she almost never did. She ran paperless, considered it a point of efficiency, but she'd needed to hold them. There was something about physical paper that her brain processed differently than a screen. She'd learned that about herself in college, during exams, when she'd print out everything she needed to truly understand. She'd read them 3 times now. Each time, the same thing happened. She started reading them as a CEO reviewing a maintenance complaint and ended reading them as something else entirely. A person who'd almost let people get badly hurt because she'd been too focused on the wrong thing. The reports were thorough. That was the first thing. He'd intervened. They weren't the kind of vague, cover-yourself documentation that maintenance workers sometimes filed to protect themselves from liability. She'd seen enough of those to recognize the type. No, these were specific, precise. Grant Calloway had included pressure differential calculations, thermal variance readings logged over several weeks, the exact serial numbers and installation dates of the affected seals, and a plain language explanation of why sustained operation above 238 psi represented a material risk to the junction assembly. He had also included a sentence, near the end of the 3rd report, that she kept coming back to. I want to be clear that my concern is not procedural. I am not filing this report to protect myself. I am filing it because I believe people will be hurt if this continues, and I would not be able to live with that. She'd read that sentence 4 times. Her assistant, Daniel, arrived at 7:15 and found her already on her 2nd cup of coffee, which he registered with the specific expression of a 26-year-old who understood that his boss's 2nd cup before 8 mornings meant something had gone significantly wrong. Morning, he said carefully. I need everything we have on Preston Vale's communications over the past 2 months, Camille said. Emails, internal memos, anything that went through the executive document management system. I need it pulled by 9. Daniel looked at her for a half second. He was smart enough not to ask why. I'll need a T authorization. You have it. I'll send it while you're walking back to your desk. He nodded and left. Camille sent the authorization before he'd reached his desk. She picked up the phone and called the head of her internal legal team, a deliberate, careful woman named Audra Fenn, who answered on the 2nd ring, despite it being 7:18 in the morning, because Audra Fenn was that kind of person. I need you in my office at 8, Camille said. Bring whoever you need. Should I know what this is about? Audra asked. Preston Vale, and 3 maintenance reports that should have reached my desk 6 weeks ago and didn't. A short pause. I'll be there at 7:45. Camille set the phone down. She looked out the window at the parking lot below, where the early shift workers were beginning to arrive. From this height, they were small, just figures moving across asphalt, heads down, coffee cups in hand, doing the thing they did every morning. She thought about line 4, about what Hector Salazar had done at 6:40 yesterday morning. 10 minutes. Another 10 minutes. She pressed her palms flat against the desk and held them there. The meeting with Audra and 2 of her associates took 2 hours and produced a list of questions that Camille needed answered before she could make any decisions. Chief among them was the question of what, exactly, Preston Vale had done with the 3 reports, and why, and whether there was any legitimate explanation she wasn't seeing. There wasn't. The IT poll came through at 9:20. Audra's team went through it, while Camille sat at the conference table in her office, not the big glass one down the hall. Her actual working office, which was smaller, and had a whiteboard covered in notes and a dyeing plant in the corner that she kept meaning to water, and by 10:45 they had a preliminary picture. Preston had received all 3 reports. The read receipts were in his email logs. He had then forwarded the 3rd one, not the first 2. Just the 3rd to a junior safety compliance officer named Briggs, with a 2-line note that read, "File this and note that operational decisions have been reviewed and approved at the executive level." Briggs had filed it. That was the end of its journey. The first 2 reports had simply stopped. Preston had read them. He had not forwarded them, not responded to them, not flagged them in any system. He had simply set them aside and continued pushing for increased production. "There's more," Audra said. She had the flat, careful tone she used when she was about to say something that was going to make Camille's morning significantly worse. "There's a thread of emails between Preston and someone outside the company. External address, personal account. We can't access the content, but the metadata shows regular contact over the past 4 months. Frequency picked up sharply about 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago was when production orders on line 4 first exceeded the safety margins in Grant's reports." Camille looked at the whiteboard. She'd been writing on it while they talked, not organized notes, just fragments. Reports buried. Timeline external contact 6 weeks. She stared at the words. "I need to know who he's been talking to," she said. "That's going to require outside counsel and possibly a subpoena, depending on where this goes," Audra said. "If we're alleging, I'm not alleging anything yet. I'm asking questions." Camille set the marker down. "But get outside counsel moving." Today, after Audra left, Camille sat alone for a while. She was not by nature a person who second-guessed herself. She'd learned early that second-guessing was a luxury that cost more than it was worth. Her father had taught her that, in his way, mostly by example. Marcus Waverly had been a man who made decisions and lived with them and moved forward, and whatever his faults, that particular quality had served him and his company well for decades. Sitting in that office with the morning going gray outside and the whiteboard full of fragments, Camille did something she almost never allowed herself to do. She thought about what would have happened if she hadn't been the CEO, if she'd been the woman on the floor, if she'd been Mrs. Chen, 12 years on line 4, daughter just started college. She sat with that for a few minutes. Then she picked up her phone and asked Daniel to pull Grant Calloway's personnel file. The file was thinner than she expected for 17 years. 1 review form per year. Mostly satisfactory to excellent ratings, with occasional notes like demonstrates exceptional institutional knowledge and reliable, highly skilled. And once, from 8 years ago, difficult to manage, resistant to directives from non-technical supervisors. That last one had been written by a floor manager who'd been let go 2 years later for unrelated reasons. Camille noted it and moved on. There was a hire date, a series of title progressions that had stopped at Specialist the 4 years ago, despite the reviews, and an emergency contact form. The emergency contact was listed as a neighbor, not a spouse, a sibling, just a neighbor. She remembered from somewhere that he was a widower. She hadn't known that when she'd ordered him out of the boardroom. She wasn't sure it would have changed anything if she had, but she knew it now. She also found, clipped to the back of the file in what appeared to be an administrative oversight, a photocopy of a letter she didn't recognize. It was on the letterhead of a law firm, Hartwell, Driscoll and Associates, dated 14 months ago, 3 days after Marcus Waverly had died. She read it twice before she fully understood what she was reading. Then she called the firm directly. The attorney's name was Edmund Hartwell. He was 71 years old, had been Marcus Waverly's personal attorney for 32 years, and had a voice that sounded like someone who had spent decades saying things carefully and choosing each word with the understanding that words had consequences. He didn't seem surprised to hear from her. "I wondered when you'd call," he said. "I sent a letter to your father's company to the General Administrative File 14 months ago. I assumed it had been received." "It appears it was received and filed without anyone reading it," Camille said flatly. A pause. "That would explain some things, Miss Hartwell. I need you to explain to me what my father did and why he did it." Edmund Hartwell explained. Marcus Waverly had established the trust 7 years before his death, during a period when the company was going through a rough stretch, and Marcus had been conducting what he privately called his inventory, a personal accounting of what the company actually was versus what it appeared to be. During that process, he had spent several weeks visiting the factory floor and the maintenance facilities, and speaking with the people who actually kept the machines running. He had met Grant Calloway during that period. "Your father described him to me as the most operationally honest person in the building," Hartwell said. His words. He meant that Grant would tell him what was actually true about the equipment, regardless of what anyone wanted to hear. Yesis intervened. "Your father said he'd asked 3 different managers about a particular ventilation system and gotten 3 different answers, all of which were shaped by what the managers thought he wanted to hear. He asked the maintenance worker and got a 40-minute walkthrough of exactly what was wrong and what it would cost to fix it. Was quiet. Your father found that quality extremely rare," Hartwell continued. He also believed that the company was structurally vulnerable to a certain type of dishonesty, the kind that comes from the top, expecting the bottom to perform miracles, and the bottom finding ways to appear compliant while cutting corners. He wanted to build in a counterweight, so he gave him 12%. An irrevocable trust, yes, structured so that it could not be contested or reversed. The shares carry full voting rights. Another pause. "I believe your father's exact reasoning was that if the company ever faced a moment where the truth was inconvenient and powerful people were choosing to ignore it, he wanted someone with a stake in the outcome who had no reason to lie." Camille looked out the window again. The parking lot was full now. "Shift change." "He never told Grant?" she asked. "He told him the trust existed. He didn't tell him the value. Your father believed that knowing the specific financial stake might change how Grant saw himself in relation to the company, and he wanted the man to remain exactly who he was." A slight pause. "I think he was right about that." After she hung up, Camille sat very still for a long time. Outside, a car alarm went off in the parking lot, and then stopped. The dying plant in the corner rustled slightly in the air from the vent above it. She thought about the boardroom 3 days ago. The way Grant Calloway had sat in that chair, slightly too far from the table, slightly apart from the main group, like someone who'd been placed there and hadn't tried to move closer. The folder he'd put on the table. The way he'd explained the pressure readings without technical jargon, without defensiveness, without any of the performance she was accustomed to seeing from people who wanted to be heard in that room. She thought about the laughter when he walked out. She had not laughed. She wanted now to be clear about that, not to herself, because she was honest with herself even when it was uncomfortable, but as a point of fact. She had not laughed. She had also not stopped it, had not looked around to see who was laughing, had not said anything at all. She had simply let it happen and moved on to the next item on the agenda, which was not the same as laughing, but wasn't far enough from it either. She picked up her phone. "Daniel, I need Grant Calloway's home address." She drove herself. She had a driver, the company provided one, but she drove herself, in her own car, which was a 4-year-old sedan that her assistant privately considered embarrassingly modest for a billionaire, and which Camille kept specifically because she'd chosen it herself before the inheritance, and she refused to let money make that decision for her retroactively. The address put her in a residential neighborhood about 20 minutes from the factory. It was the kind of neighborhood that had been built in the 70s and had aged into something comfortable and slightly worn, mature trees, small yards, houses with mismatched additions that had been put on over decades. Grant's house was a single story with a concrete porch, and a bike leaned against the railing that was too small to be his. She sat in her car for a minute. She was not nervous. She told herself this clearly. Tell yourself. She was also aware that, sitting in a car outside someone's house, you're not nervous is somewhat undermined by the fact that you've been sitting there for 60 seconds and haven't gotten out yet. She got out. She rang the doorbell. There was a pause. Footsteps. The door opened, and Grant Calloway was standing there in jeans and a gray, long-sleeved shirt, holding a dish towel and looking at her the way you'd look at someone who had appeared on your porch without a reasonable explanation for being there. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "Miss Waverly," he said finally. His voice was neutral. Not cold, exactly. Neutral. "Mr. Calloway." She held his gaze. "I'd like to talk, if you're willing." He studied her for a moment. She had the feeling he was deciding something, and that the decision was not a small one, and that he was taking exactly as long as he needed to make it without any concern for whether the length of the pause was awkward. "Come in," he said. The house was clean in the practical way of someone who cleaned because things needed to be clean, not because they were performing cleanliness. There was a drawing taped to the refrigerator, a crayon figure she assumed was Grant, labeled "My Dad Fixes," things in unsteady block letters, and a half-finished glass of orange juice on the counter, and a small pile of folded laundry on the end of the couch that Grant moved without comment before gesturing for her to sit. He sat across from her. Kitchen table. The dish towel was still in his hands. He set it down on the table beside him. "I assume you've seen the reports," he said. "All 3 of them," she said. "Yes. And you understand they were received by Preston's office." Something shifted in his face. Not satisfaction, it wasn't that. Something more complicated. The expression of someone who'd been right about something terrible and found no pleasure in it. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, from the line. The fact that this was his first question, not "what are you going to do about it?" Not "I told you so," not "I want my job back," landed somewhere in Camille's chest in a way she hadn't expected. "Yes," she said. Hector Salazar shut the line down before it went critical. "Everyone is okay." Grant nodded slowly. He looked at the table for a moment. "Hector's a good man. He knows when to stop waiting for authorization." Camille folded her hands on the table. She had prepared things to say in the car. She'd run through the conversation several times, which was something she did before difficult meetings. It wasn't scripted, just oriented. She knew what she needed to say, and had mapped roughly how she intended to say it. She found now, sitting across from him in his kitchen, with the crayon drawing visible over his left shoulder, that the prepared version felt wrong. Dishonest. Nothing she'd planned was dishonest. Just insufficient. "I owe you an apology," she said. "What happened in that boardroom was wrong. I had information from you that I should have taken seriously, and I didn't. And part of that is because Preston kept it from me. But part of it is because I looked at you and made a decision about how much weight your concern deserved before I'd actually considered it." Grant looked at her steadily. He didn't say "it's okay" or "don't worry about it." He also didn't say anything harsh. He just let the apology exist. "I need you to come back," Camille said. "As your maintenance worker," he said. It wasn't quite a question, as whatever makes sense. "I need people in that building I can trust right now, and I've just discovered that I have very few of them." She paused. "And you have a stake in what happens to Redwood Forge. A significant one. You deserve to have a say." Grant's expression changed slightly. "The trust," he said. "You knew. I knew there was something. Marcus told me years ago that he'd arranged something. He didn't tell me what. A beat. I assumed it was a pension provision or something along those lines. It's 12% of the company," Camille said, "in an irrevocable trust with full voting rights." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Outside, a car went past slowly. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started up, and then stopped almost immediately. Grant looked at the table. He picked up the dish towel and set it down again. She got the sense he was doing math she couldn't see, not financial math, but some other kind of accounting. "What exactly are you asking me to come back as?" he said. "A shareholder," Camille said, "with the right to speak and be heard. My subordinate. I don't have a clean word for it. My counterpart in some capacity. On the things that matter." And what matters right now? Line 4, the acquisition. And whatever Preston Vale has been doing that he didn't want me to know about. She looked at him directly. Because I don't think he buried those reports just to make the production numbers look good. I think there's something else going on. And I think it has to do with the deal we're about to close. And I think we're about to make a very serious mistake. Grant was quiet for a moment. She could hear the refrigerator humming behind her. I have a condition, he said. All right, I leave every day at 3 o'clock. Daughter gets out of school at 3:15. That's not negotiable. She looked at him. She thought about what Edmund Hartwell had said about her father, that he'd wanted someone with no reason to lie. She thought about the boardroom 3 days ago, and about the laughter, about the fact that this man had sat across from a table of powerful people and said, I cannot support that decision. No. And then walked out and gone to pick up his daughter from school. 3 o'clock, she said, every day. That's fine. Grant nodded once. He stood up and went to the counter and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if she wanted one, which she found, unexpectedly, something of a relief. He set one in front of her and sat back down. Tell me what you know about the buyer, he said. They talked for 2 hours. It wasn't a comfortable conversation exactly. It had the quality of 2 people who didn't entirely trust each other, trying to figure out what they actually had in common, which takes more effort than either pure trust or pure suspicion. Camille was used to conversations where her position established the terms. Grant was used to conversations where his position meant he had to fight for his words to be considered at all. Neither dynamic applied here, and they both had to keep adjusting. But they got somewhere. Camille walked him through what she knew about the acquisition. The buyer was a holding company called Vantage Meridian, based in Delaware, with a portfolio of mid-size industrial facilities across the Southeast. The deal had been structured as a full asset acquisition. They weren't buying shares. They were buying the company outright, including its facilities, equipment, and property. Including the property. All of it? Grant asked. All of it. Grant wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. There's a parcel on the back end of the property, he said slowly. East side past the secondary lot, about 60 acres. It's been fallow since before I started working there. The parcel. Has anyone looked at it recently? In the context of the deal? Camille looked at him. Why? Because about 8 months ago, I was doing some drainage work along the east fence line, and I ran into a survey crew I didn't recognize. They said they were doing routine county work, but they had private equipment, not county standard. I noted it and forgot about it. He paused. Until right now. She looked at him for a long moment. What would make that land valuable? Grant said, but I think you should find out. She already had her phone out. The coffee went cold again, same as it had the morning before. Neither of them noticed. What they were beginning to see, sitting at Grant Calloway's kitchen table with the crayon drawing watching over them from the refrigerator, was the shape of something much larger than a safety violation. Something that had been constructed carefully over months by people who had assumed nobody was paying close enough attention to notice. They had made the same mistake Preston Vale had made. They had looked past the quiet man and assumed he wasn't watching. Grant came back on a Monday. He didn't make an announcement about it. He didn't send an email or ask anyone to prepare anything. He just showed up at 6:40 in the morning the way he always had, in the employee lot, nodded to Mickey at the gate, and walked to the maintenance entrance. The only difference was that he stopped at the front desk first and asked for a visitor badge, because his access card had been deactivated when he left, and the woman at the front desk, a heavyset, cheerful woman named Donna, who had worked reception for 11 years, looked at him over her reading glasses and said, "They shut you out already? You were only gone a week." "About that," Grant said. "Give me 2 minutes." She typed something, made a phone call, typed something else. "There you go. Though I have to say, they've got you listed as," she squinted at the screen, "shareholder representative and operational liaison." Whatever that means. It means I get to say things, and people have to at least pretend to listen, Grant said. Donna laughed. It was a good, real laugh, the kind that meant she'd been waiting for something to laugh about. He went straight to the maintenance bay. The morning crew was already there, 5 men and 1 woman who covered the early shift equipment checks. Most of them had been there when Grant was there. They looked up when he came in, and there was a moment of collective adjustment. The way a room adjusts when something it expected to be gone turns out not to be gone. Ruben, a 29-year-old who'd been hired 2 years ago and had spent his first month following Grant around asking questions, said, "You're back," Grant said. "For now." Meaning what? Meaning let's get to work and see what happens. He picked up the maintenance log from the hook by the door and started reading. "Somebody tell me the current status on line 4. What followed was not a triumphant return. It was a man in work clothes, reading a clipboards, and asking questions and getting answers that mostly confirmed what he'd suspected. The line had been shut down correctly by Hector. The immediate leak had been contained, but the underlying seal assembly needed to be pulled and replaced properly, not patched. Whoever had done the preliminary assessment after the incident had signed off on a patch and monitor approach that Grant could see just from the log entries was insufficient. "Who authorized the patch?" he asked. Ruben glanced at the others. "Facilities manager, guy named Kowalski. Kowalski's still here? He's in at 8. Good. I want to talk to him before anything else happens to that line." He spent the first 2 hours doing what he always did, walking the floor, checking readings, making notes, talking to the people who actually ran the machines. This was what 17 years had given him. Not authority, not a title that meant anything in organizational charts, but a specific, accumulated understanding of how this building functioned at the level where function and failure actually intersected. He knew that the secondary coolant loop on line 2 ran 3 degrees hotter than the gauges showed because the sensor had been recalibrated incorrectly in 2019 and nobody had corrected it. He knew that the overhead crane in the East Bay had a 2-second delay in its emergency stop that had reported 6 times without being addressed. He knew that the fire suppression system in the North Corridor was inspected every March, and that the March before last, the inspector had signed the form without testing 2 of the 7 activation points. All of this. He documented all of this. And for the most part, the documentation had sat in files that nobody read until something happened. The difference now, he understood, was that he had standing. Just moral standing, which he'd always had, but legal and financial standing. The kind that made ignoring him a decision with measurable consequences. He wasn't sure yet how he felt about that. It was useful. He could see already that it was useful. But there was something uncomfortable about it too, the idea that the same concerns, the same numbers, the same plainly stated risks only mattered now because of a piece of paper in a lawyer's office. He tried not to think about that too directly. It was a useful thing to be angry about, but not a productive one, and he had work to do. At 8:15, Camille called. He was in the sub-basement checking the junction assembly himself, which meant he was on his knees on a concrete floor with a flashlight, and he answered the phone with his free hand. "Preston is in the building," she said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, a tightness. "He came in this morning acting as though nothing has happened. He's called 2 meetings for this afternoon. Does he know you've pulled his communications?" "I don't think so, not yet." A pause. "He stopped by my office this morning, walked in without knocking, which he does, and told me he'd arranged for an independent engineer to assess line 4. Said he wanted to get ahead of any regulatory concerns." Grant moved the flashlight along the seal housing. "His engineer or ours?" He named the firm. "I didn't recognize it." "Send me the name." She did. Grant looked at it. He'd heard of the firm, a mid-size engineering consultancy that did a lot of industrial compliance work. They were competent. They were also, he knew from a conversation he'd had 3 years ago with a former employee at a conference, extremely good at producing assessments that aligned with what their clients needed them to say. "He's getting ahead of the audit," Grant said. "If he controls the engineering assessment, he controls the narrative. The deal goes through, the buyer gets what they want, and the line 4 incident becomes a footnote." "That's what I think too." Camille paused again. He also said something else. He said the company couldn't afford distractions right now, and that he'd heard I was, quote, consulting with former staff, and that he wanted to discuss it. Grant was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't know about the trust yet," he said. "He knows you came back to the building. He doesn't know why you have the right to be here. How long before he figures it out? Maybe a day. Maybe 2. Grant pushed himself up from his knees and wiped the concrete dust off his jeans. He looked at the seal assembly. The patch Kowalski had signed off on was adequate in the way that a bucket under a leaky roof was adequate. It addressed the immediate problem and nothing else. "We have a day," he said. "Maybe 2. He'd intervened. Camille had been running the company for 14 months, and in that time she had developed a functional, if not warm, working relationship with most of the board. She knew which members were aligned with her, which were aligned with what they believed was their own best interest, and which were genuinely trying to do the right thing, and were simply slow at it. What she had not fully understood until now was how much of her picture of the company had been shaped by what Preston Vale chose to show her. Preston for 3 years. He'd been in place when she arrived. One of the senior executives her father had trusted with day-to-day operations, and she'd kept him partly because removing him in the first months would have looked like instability, and partly because he was genuinely good at his job, organized, efficient, focused on execution in a way that freed her to focus on strategy. She'd appreciated that. She was now sitting in her office at 10 in the morning with a legal pad in front of her and Audra on the phone, rethinking every significant operational decision she'd made in the past 14 months and trying to determine which ones Preston had framed for her and how. "The freight project," she said. Audra's voice was careful. "That's the piece we need more on. We know there's a planned expansion. It's been kept out of public filings because it's still in the regulatory approval stage. What we don't know is the exact route or the exact property it affects. Can we find out? I have someone making calls. Probably this afternoon. And the 60 acres. It's been assessed as low-value agricultural land since 1987. Reassessment since, which is itself unusual. Most county assessors update their records every few years. Wrote reassessment on the legal pad and underlined it twice. So if someone knew the freight route was coming through and knew the reassessment would eventually have to happen, they would know the land was going to become extremely valuable, and they would want to acquire the company before anyone else did that math," Audra said. "And if Preston had access to that information, then he had approximately 18 months to position himself to benefit from it." Audra paused. "This is still speculative. We need documentation." "We're working on it," Camille said. After she hung up, she sat for a moment, looking out the window. The day was overcast and flat. She watched a maintenance truck navigate the access road below. She thought about Grant somewhere in the sub-basement right now, doing whatever he did down there in the dark with a flashlight. He'd infiend. She thought about the conversation at his kitchen table, the way he'd asked about the survey crew he'd seen 8 months ago, the way his face had changed when he made the connection. He hadn't been dramatic about it. He'd just said, "I think you should find out," the same way he'd said everything else, in a tone that made the statement its own complete thing without needing her to confirm that it was important. She'd spent her whole professional life in rooms where people performed their intelligence, where every observation was staged, every question was rhetorical, every comment carried the subtext of "notice how smart I am." Grant Calloway said what he actually thought, and then stopped talking, and waited to see what happened. It was such a specific, unusual quality that she'd initially misread it as passivity. She picked up the phone. "Daniel, get me the property records on the Redwood Forge East parcel, and get me anything we have on Vantage Meridian's principals, the holding company, the actual people." Hector Salazar found Grant at lunchtime. Grant was in the break room eating a sandwich he'd brought from home turkey, because Lily had helped him make lunches that morning, and turkey was her current verdict on the correct sandwich at Hector, when Hector came in and sat across from him without being invited, which was Hector's way. Hector was a solid, deliberate man who had spent 30 years on industrial floors and had the posture of someone who'd long since stopped carrying anything he didn't need. He looked at Grant for a moment before he said anything. "The same," he said. "It's been a week. I know. I thought you might look different." "Why?" Hector shrugged. "Man comes back as a partial owner of the place he left. Sometimes that changes how they carry themselves." He looked at him. "Does it show?" Hector said. "That's what I'm telling you. You look the same." He paused. "That's a good thing." Grant ate his sandwich. Hector got up and poured himself a cup of coffee, came back, sat down again. The break room was mostly empty. The main lunch rush had been and gone. People are talking, Hector said. About what? About the line. Why it happened. About you being back. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Mrs. Chen asked me this morning if the company was going to close. She's heard something, I don't know where she heard it, but she's heard something about the deal, that there's going to be layoffs after it closes. Grant set his sandwich down. What did you tell her? I told her I didn't know. Which is the truth? Hector looked at him directly. Is it the truth for you too? Not entirely, Grant said. Meaning? Meaning I think if the deal goes through the way it's currently structured, there's a real possibility the plant closes. Because it's not viable. Because the buyer may not want the plant. They may want the property. Hector was quiet for a moment. That 60-acre parcel, he said. Grant looked at him. About it? I've worked here 26 years. About every piece of this property. Another pause. I also know that about 9 months ago a county surveyor came through and spent 2 days on that back section and never explained what he was looking at. Private surveyor, Grant said. Not county. Hector nodded slowly. I wondered about that. Did you report it? I mentioned it to the facilities manager at the time. He said it was routine drainage assessment and I should mind my area. Hector's jaw tightened slightly. So I did. Grant looked at the table for a moment. I need you to write down exactly what you remember. When you saw them, what equipment they had, which section of the property, anything they said. Clean it up. Don't make it formal. Just write down what you actually saw. You think it matters? I think it might be the kind of thing that looks small on its own and isn't small at all when it sits next to the right other things. Hector considered that. He nodded once, stood up, and took his coffee with him. At the door he stopped. Grant. Yeah, there are 412 people on that floor, counting admin. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Grant finished his sandwich. The information about the freight expansion came through at 3 in the afternoon, which meant Grant was already gone. He left at 2:58, said a brief word to Camille's assistant about where he could be reached, and driven across town to the school. Lily came out the front doors wearing a yellow raincoat that was slightly too big for her and carrying a spelling test with a gold star on it that she held out to him before she'd even reached the car. 94, she said. What happened to the other 6 points? She scrunched her face. I spelled necessary wrong. How'd you spell it? Necessary, with 2 S's in the middle. That's almost right. Almost isn't right, Dad. He looked at the test. He said, It isn't. She got in the car, and they drove to the grocery store because they were out of eggs. Lily talked the entire way about a book she was reading and a disagreement she'd had at lunch with her friend Sophie about whether dolphins were smarter than dogs, which she considered a genuinely unresolved question requiring more research. Grant listened and answered and did not think for those 45 minutes about pressure seals or property surveys or Preston Vale. He cooked dinner, chicken and rice, because the spaghetti rotation had been last Thursday, and he tried not to repeat within the week. Lily sat at the table with her spelling words, writing each one 3 times the way her teacher had asked, and the kitchen was warm and ordinary and smelled like garlic. His phone buzzed at 6:15. Camille. He looked at it and then looked at Lily. I need to take this, he said. Is it work? Yeah. She waved him off in a way that was pure Elena, the same exact gesture, the same acceptance of it, and it landed in his chest the way it sometimes did, with a brief, clean pain that passed almost as quickly as it came. He stepped onto the back porch. Tell me, he said. Camille's voice had that quality it got when she was controlling something. The freight expansion is called the Meridian Corridor Project. It's a private rail and heavy freight line, still in regulatory approval, expected to be announced publicly within the next 18 months. The projected route runs directly through or adjacent to the Redwood Forge East property. All 60 acres. Grant leaned against the porch railing. Above the neighbor's roofline, the sky was doing something complicated with clouds and the last of the light. What's the land worth when the project goes public? He asked. Conservative estimate from the real estate attorney I spoke to this afternoon, somewhere between $40 and $80 million, depending on final route confirmation and what the buyer negotiates with the freight consortium. $40 to $80 million for land that had been sitting fallow and unassessed since 1987, classified on county records as low-value agricultural property, worth roughly $200,000. Vantage Meridian, Grant said. Who are they really? Two of the three primary principals have documented relationships with the Freight Consortium. One of them served on the consortium's advisory board until 14 months ago, when he resigned and we believe moved his interests into Vantage Meridian instead. A pause. Want the factory, Grant. They never did. They want to acquire the whole asset package, strip out the operational components, sell or close the plant, and hold the land until the project goes public. And Preston? We found a consulting agreement. It's buried in a personal LLC he set up 2 years ago, but Audra's team found the thread today. He's been receiving monthly payments from a company that traces back through 2 intermediary entities to Vantage Meridian. She paused. He's been on their payroll while sitting in the COO seat of this company. Grant was quiet for a moment. Through the back door, he could hear Lily asking something, probably whether dinner was ready, because she had a precise internal clock for meals. He held up one finger she couldn't see. Does he know we know? Grant asked. Yet, but it won't stay that way much longer. He spent most of this afternoon pushing the board members he's close to for an accelerated vote timeline. He wants the acquisition approved before the audit is complete. How much time do we have? Board meeting is scheduled for Thursday. He's trying to move it to Tuesday. That was 48 hours. I need something from you, Grant said. What? The original maintenance reports. Not the copies from Preston's files. The originals from when I submitted them, they'd be in the document management system, with the original timestamps. And the copier logs. Our copier system timestamps every document that goes through it. If Preston printed those reports and then removed them from circulation, the log will show it. A pause. You think he destroyed them? I think he tried to manage them, which isn't the same as destroying them, but it's close enough to look very bad in front of a board if you have the log to show what happened. How do you know about the copier system? Because I fixed it in 2018, and I was the one who configured the logging function. He's ever thought to look at it, because nobody ever needed to. He paused. Until now. The next day was a Tuesday, and it began badly. Grant arrived at 6:40 to find that his access card had been deactivated again overnight, because anyone had formally revoked it. When he called Donna at the front desk, she found the change order in the system. Submitted at 9:47 the previous evening by a facilities management account that technically had the administrative authority to make the change, even if the person who'd used it had no legitimate reason to do so. He called Camille. I'm outside, he said. She was there in 12 minutes, which meant she'd been in the building already. She came through the main entrance, not the executive entrance, and spoke briefly to Donna before walking out to meet Grant on the front steps. She was wearing the same kind of suit she always wore, her hair pulled back, but she had the look of someone who hadn't gone home the night before, or had gone home very late and come back very early. Come in, she said. Someone on Preston's side is moving fast, he said as they walked. He also sent an email to 3 board members at 11 last night. After most people were asleep, recommending that my unilateral engagement with a former employee in a shareholder capacity be reviewed before the board meeting on the grounds that it represents a potential conflict of interest. Her voice was level. He used the phrase compromised judgment. Grant thought about that. He's trying to get you out of the proceedings. Yes. Can he? Not if the board understands what he's actually done. But he's betting I can't get the full picture together before the vote. She pushed open the stairwell door and held it. He doesn't know what we have. What do we have? Grant asked. To challenge her to take stock, he needed to know exactly what they were working with. They stopped on the second-floor landing. Camille looked at him. For a moment, in the fluorescent light of the stairwell, with nobody else around, she looked younger than 30. In a flattering, softened way, in the way of someone carrying something genuinely heavy and not performing anything about it. We have the 3 reports with original timestamps, she said. We have the read receipts showing Preston opened them. We have the copier logs you told me about. IT pulled them? Last night. And yes, they show those documents went through Preston's printer in sequence and then no further distribution was logged, which means he printed them personally, and they didn't go anywhere in the system after that. We have the consulting agreement from his LLC. We have the external email metadata showing contact with Vantage Meridian's principal. We have Hector's written account of the survey crew. She paused. And we have Edmund Hartwell prepared to appear before the board to verify the trust documents. Grant counted through it. And the freight project? Still not public. But we have documentation of the route and the connection to Vantage Meridian's principals. Audra thinks it's enough to establish motive clearly. Preston's going to say the consulting agreement was disclosed and appropriate. It wasn't disclosed to me or to the board. He'll say it was disclosed to the appropriate parties and that your investigation is retaliatory. Looked at him steadily. Is that what you'd say if you were defending him? I'm trying to think about what he'll do when he's backed into a corner, Grant said, because a man who's been doing this for 14 months doesn't fold quietly. She nodded. I know. He's going to try to control the room. He's good at that. Grant thought about the board meeting he'd sat in, how Preston had managed the energy of that room, how he'd known when to step back and let Camille take the confrontational position, how he'd used the quiet in the room. You need the board to see the full picture before he has a chance to frame it. During, not after. Before they sit down. The meeting is Thursday morning. Wednesday evening, you call the board members individually. A group call. Individual. You tell each one what you're going to present, in plain language, before Preston has a chance to pre-brief them or manage their expectations. You take away his ability to shape the room. Camille looked at him. That's going to be a lot of phone calls. 14 members. How many there are. Then you know what Wednesday night looks like. Something shifted in her face. Not agreement. Exactly something more than agreement. She was doing her own accounting, the invisible math. She was also, he thought, not accustomed to someone telling her how to work a room. He waited to see how it landed. You're right, she said. They went upstairs. Preston made his move Wednesday afternoon. He called an emergency executive session, a mechanism in the company's governance documents intended for genuine operational crises, and used it to convene a meeting of the four most senior executives remaining in his sphere. Grant heard about it from Audra, who had a mole in that meeting she wouldn't identify, 40 minutes after it concluded. Preston had used the session to formally recommend that Camille recuse herself from the acquisition decision on the grounds of compromised objectivity. He'd presented a legal argument prepared, Audra noted, which meant he'd had outside counsel working on it, that her relationship with Grant Calloway represented an undisclosed material interest. He'd also moved, in the same session, to accelerate the board vote to the following morning, citing urgency around the acquisition timeline. Was moving fast because he was scared. Grant was in the main floor office, a small room with a window that looked onto the production floor, when Camille called to tell him. He's pushing the vote to tomorrow morning, she said. 8 a.m. Then so are we, Grant said. There was a pause. How are you doing? It was an unexpected question. He looked through the window at the production floor, where line 3 was running, and Mrs. Chen was at her station, and Ruben was checking a gauge on the far wall. Ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Everything functioning as it should. I'm okay, he said. And then, because it was true and there was no reason not to say it, a little scared. Same as before. Same as before meaning the boardroom? What did you do with it then? She asked. Closed my laptop and walked out, a short silence. That's not an option tomorrow. No, Grant said. Tomorrow I stay and finish it. He spent the rest of the afternoon doing 2 things simultaneously. He continued the repair work on line 4, not because anyone required him to, but because the work needed to be done, and he was the person who knew how to do it, and because somewhere in the doing of it he found the particular stillness that the big things in his life required. He'd learned this slowly, over years. The doing of the immediate real thing while the larger thing waited. It didn't solve anything. It just kept him from spinning. The second thing he did was organize the documents. Formally, he wasn't a lawyer and didn't try to think like one. But in the particular systematic way his mind worked, the way he'd organized safety data for 17 years, by sequence, by cause and effect, by what led to what. He laid it in the order a person would need to understand it if they'd never seen any of it before. At 2:55, he put on his jacket. He had one stop before he went to get Lily. He drove to the county records office, which closed at 4, and spent 20 minutes with the clerk property assessment records for the Redwood Forge East parcel, going back to 1985. He found the last formal assessment. He found the notation that no reassessment had been requested or conducted since. He found in a 2019 cross-reference log a notation that an assessment request had been received and then withdrawn by an entity whose name he had to look at twice. A shell company, one that Audra's team had already identified as an intermediary between Preston Vales LLC and Vantage Meridian. Someone had requested the reassessment which would have revealed the land's potential value once the freight corridor became public, and then pulled the request back. Because a reassessment on the record would have been discoverable, would have raised questions. He asked the clerk to make him a certified copy. "This is public record?" he asked. "Everything in this office is public record," the clerk said. He paid the copying fee in cash and drove to the school. Lily came out in her yellow raincoat again. She had mud on one knee from recess and was annoyed about it, and she talked about recess and the mud and the injustice of asphalt that held puddles for the entire drive home. Grant listened and said the appropriate things and thought, underneath it, about a man who had helped the company he worked for nearly destroy itself and nearly kill people, and had done it all for money, and about the quiet, 60 acres, that had sat behind the factory for decades while everyone looked past it. He thought about what Hector had said. 412 people, counting admin. At home, he put the certified copy in the folder with the other documents. He made dinner, scrambled eggs and toast, because it was a simple night, and they both needed simple. Lily ate and talked, and drew something in her sketchbook. Afterward, some elaborate creature she was designing that had elements of several real animals combined in ways that violated most biological principles. At 8:30, he put her to bed. He sat on the edge of her bed, the way he'd done. Every night since she was born, a different bed, different house, but the same ritual. And she told him one thing about her day that she hadn't told him yet, which was their rule. Tonight it was that she'd helped a smaller kid find his classroom after lunch because he was new and didn't know where to go. "Good," Grant said. "He was really lost," she said. "Was a good thing you did." She pulled Gerald, the one-eyed elephant, closer. "Is everything okay? With work?" He looked at her. She was 8 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, and she read him better than most adults did. "It's complicated," he said, "but I think it's going to be okay." "You think or you know?" "I think." She seemed to consider whether this was acceptable. "Okay," she said. He turned off the light, left the door at 45 degrees, and went back to the kitchen. He sat at the table where Camille had sat across from him less than a week ago. He opened the folder and looked at the documents one more time, in sequence. He'd done this 4 times today. Each time, the picture was the same. Each time it held. He closed the folder. He went to bed at 10:30. He set his alarm for 5:15. He lay in the dark looking at the water stain, shaped like a boot on the ceiling. He did the 10 seconds. Exactly 10, not longer. In 7 hours, he was going to walk into the same room where a roomful of powerful people had laughed at his back. This time he was going to put a cardboard box on the glass table and stay until it was finished. He woke up 4 minutes before the alarm. That happened sometimes, his body deciding it had taken enough sleep and there was no point pretending otherwise. He lay there for the 4 minutes watching the ceiling, and then the alarm went off and he turned it off and sat up. 5:15, same as always. He showered, made coffee, checked on Lily, who was still deeply asleep with Gerald tucked under one arm and her hair magnificent in its chaos. He stood in her doorway for the usual 3 seconds. He went back to the kitchen. He made her lunch for the day, turkey, again, because she decided last week that turkey was correct, and he hadn't argued and left it in the refrigerator with a note on the counter explaining that Mrs. Pacheco would take her to school and that he'd pick her up at 3:15 no matter what. He'd called Mrs. Pacheco the night before. She'd said, of course, don't worry. She'd been following the news about the factory, and she hoped everything worked out. He hadn't known it was in the news. He'd looked it up after hanging up. It was a brief item acquisition proceedings at Redwood Forge Industries, delayed amid internal review with no specifics. But enough that people were talking, which meant the clock had gotten shorter overnight. Public attention had a way of forcing decisions. He picked up the cardboard box by the door. He'd packed it, the night before the printed documents, in order, each set paper-clipped separately. The original maintenance reports, the copier logs, the read receipt records, the consulting agreement from Preston's LLC, the external email metadata, the property records with the withdrawn reassessment notation, Hector's written account, and the letter from Edmund Hartwell confirming the structure and validity of the trust. The box was not dramatic. It was a standard office box, the kind that copy paper came in, with the lid set on top. He'd written nothing on it. It held what it held. He put it in the back seat of his car and drove to Redwood Forge. He arrived at 7:10. The board meeting was called for 8. He had 50 minutes. Mickey at the gate waved him through without being asked, which meant Camille had updated the security protocols. Grant parked in the employee lot, not the executive lot, the employee lot, because he was an employee, among other things, and he saw no reason to change where he parked and carried the box through the maintenance entrance and up the back stairs to the 4th floor. Was already in the conference room. Camille was she was standing at the window with a coffee cup, looking down at the parking lot below, and she turned when he came in. She looked like she'd slept about as much as he had, which was to say enough to function and not enough to feel easy. Her suit was pressed. Her hair was pulled back the way it always was. She looked at the cardboard box and then at him. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." He set the box on the side credenza and took off his jacket. "How did the calls go last night?" 13 of 14. Langford didn't pick up. He was on a flight. I left a voicemail and sent a follow-up email with the summary document Audra prepared. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Most of them were quiet, which I think is a good sign. When board members are angry or skeptical, they talk. When they're taking something in, they go quiet. What about the ones who are close to Preston? Halverson and Park. She said the names like she'd been turning them over. Halverson I couldn't read. Park asked me if I was sure about the consulting agreement, and when I said yes, she asked me to send her the documentation directly, which I did. Park is a careful person, Grant said. He'd seen her in 2 board meetings. She asked specific questions and didn't move until she had specific answers. If she asked for the documentation, she's going to read it. Camille set her cup down. Preston hasn't arrived yet. His assistant says he has a 7:30 call. Grant nodded. He looked around the room. It was the same room, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the long glass table, the chairs that cost too much. The same view of the parking lot. From this angle, he could see the roofline of the maintenance building, where he'd spent 17 years doing work that nobody in this room had ever thought to understand. "How are you doing?" he asked. He meant it as a genuine question, not a formality. Looked at him. "I keep thinking about what my father did," she said. "Setting up the trust. Not telling me. Choosing someone I'd never met over people he'd worked with for decades." She paused. "I was angry about it last night for a while. That he didn't tell me. That he saw something about this company that I didn't see, and his solution was to build in a safeguard, without telling me the safeguard existed." "Were you angry at him or at yourself?" She considered that. "Mostly myself." She picked up her coffee again. "Yes, he'd see to me when knew I'd need someone like you, and he knew I'd be too proud to find that person on my own." Grant didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't be either too much or not enough. "Edmund Hartwell is coming at 7:50, she said, returning to the practical, which he's understood was her way of moving through things. "He'll be here when the board arrives. His presence makes the trust legally undeniable." "And Preston's legal argument about your recusal?" Audra addressed it in the briefing documents I sent last night. "The argument has no standing because my engagement with you is in direct recognition of your existing shareholder status, which was established by an irrevocable trust that predates my tenure as CEO. I wasn't creating a relationship with you. I was acknowledging one that already existed." She said it the way Audra had probably explained it to her precisely, with the specific weight of terms that meant things in documents. Preston's attorneys apparently didn't know about the trust when they drafted the recusal argument, which tells you something about how carefully he did his homework. "He never thought to look," Grant said. "He didn't." She looked at him. He saw a maintenance worker and made assumptions. Grant moved to the table and set out 2 copies of the summary document at the head position and at the seat beside it. He did it quietly, without making it a gesture. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think your father also knew you'd get here on your own eventually. The trust was a time constraint, a way to make sure the truth came out before the damage was irreversible. He glanced at her. A comment on your judgment. Camille was quiet for a moment. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. He straightened the papers. There's a difference. Board members began arriving at 7:40. Grant recognized most of them from the previous meeting. He took their seats. They came in separately, or in pairs, took their seats, accepted coffee from Daniel, and moved through the small adjustments people make when they're entering a room where something significant is about to happen. Some of them looked at Grant directly. A few nodded. Langford, who had apparently caught an earlier flight and made it, after all came in last, shook Camille's hand, looked at Grant, and said, "You're Calloway," as a statement rather than a question, Grant said. "Marcus talked about you," Langford said. "Years ago. I'd forgotten until Camille called me last night." He didn't elaborate. He took his seat. Edmund Hartwell arrived at 7:52, which was 2 minutes later than planned, and clearly bothered him, because he apologized to Camille as soon as he came in and explained that the parking structure had changed since his last visit. He was a compact, white-haired man with a manner that was simultaneously unhurried and exact, the kind of person who had spent decades being the most prepared individual in whatever room he entered and had stopped needing to announce it. He shook Grant's hand and held it for a moment. "Your father would have liked this," he said, and then seemed to realize that wasn't quite right and corrected himself. "Marcus, I mean, he would have liked seeing this." "I know what you meant," Grant said. Preston Vale arrived at 7:58. He came in talking not on the phone, but to his own attorney, a tall man in a gray suit, who walked half a step behind him and was clearly being given instructions in a low, rapid tone. Preston was dressed the way he always dressed, the slightly too small shirt, the posture that said he believed he was still the most physically imposing person in a room. He came through the door, and his eyes moved across the room in the practiced way of someone taking inventory, and then he saw Grant standing at the credenza, and his eyes stopped. Lasted less than 2 seconds. Then he moved on, continued talking to his attorney, took his seat at the table as though nothing had happened. But Grant had seen it. The recognition, the calculation that followed. Preston had known Grant was coming. He hadn't known how prepared they would be. Called the meeting to order at 8:02. She stood at the head of the table and did not sit down, which was a choice Grant noticed. Standing in a seated room meant something. It said she was not going to let this become a conversation where everyone was equal. It was her meeting and she was running it. "Before we move to the agenda," she said, "I need to address several matters that bear directly on the acquisition vote and on this company's governance. I'm going to be direct about what I've found, and I'm going to present documentation. I'd ask that everyone hold their questions until I've finished the full picture, because the pieces matter in context." She was good at this. Grant had known she would be, but watching it was different from knowing it. She was clear without being simple, direct without being brutal, and she moved through the material in the sequence he'd laid out, cause and effect. What led to what, which meant the room, was always a step behind her, always receiving the next piece before they'd finished processing the last one. It was a specific skill, the architecture of an argument, and she had it. She started with line 4, the original safety warnings, the timestamps, the pressure data. She put the maintenance reports on the screen, Grant's 3 reports, in order, with the submitted dates and the read receipts, showing Preston's access times. She walked through the copier log, documents printed, no subsequent distribution in the system. She did not editorialize. She stated what the record showed and moved forward. Then she moved to Preston's consulting agreement. Then she moved to she put the LLC registration on screen, the payment records, the corporate structure connecting it to Vantage Meridian's intermediary entities. She put the external email metadata on screen, not the content, which they didn't have, but the frequency and the timing, which mapped precisely onto every major escalation in the production orders. The room was very quiet. Halverson, who had been Preston's man, was looking at the screen with an expression Grant couldn't fully read, not blank, not shocked, somewhere between them. The face of someone realizing that the thing they'd been told was a misunderstanding is not, in fact, a misunderstanding. Preston said, "This is a selective presentation of incomplete. I'll ask you to hold your response until I've finished, Camille said. Her voice didn't change temperature. You'll have time to speak. She moved to the property. The 60 acres. The freight expansion, the projected route, the connection between Vantage Meridian's principals and the consortium. She put the withdrawn reassessment request on screen, the one Grant had pulled from the county records the previous afternoon, and she explained what a property reassessment would have revealed and why someone had moved to cancel it. She put the survey crew account on screen. Hector Salazar's written statement, dated the previous afternoon, describing what he'd seen 9 months ago at the east fence line. The survey crew used private equipment, Camille said. County standard. They identified themselves as doing routine county work, which was false. The survey was conducted without the company's knowledge or authorization on property that Vantage Meridian had not yet acquired and had no right to access. She looked at the board. Vantage Meridian does not want this factory, she said. They want this property. Their intention, as best as we can determine from the documentation assembled, is to acquire the company, dissolve the operations, and hold the 60-acre east parcel until the Meridian Corridor Freight Project becomes public, at which point the land value increases by an estimated $40 to $80 million. The factory closes, 412 workers lose their jobs, and the principals of Vantage Meridian, along with at least one person in this room, profit substantially. She stopped. Edmund Hartwell, who had been sitting quietly to Grant's left, spoke for the first time. He confirmed the existence and validity of the trust. He stated the percentage, the voting rights, and the irrevocable nature of the instrument. He noted that Marcus Waverly had established it 7 years prior and that it was binding under current corporate law in this state. He said it in the particular way lawyers said definitive things slowly, with complete sentences, in a tone that made the information feel like something being installed rather than stated. Several board members looked at Grant. Grant looked back at them and didn't say anything. Preston spoke. He'd been holding it for 18 minutes, which was, Grant thought, genuine discipline. 18 minutes of sitting at a table while your professional demolition was conducted in front of you and maintaining the appearance of calm. When he spoke, his voice was controlled. What you've presented here is a set of documents assembled by someone with a personal financial stake in blocking this acquisition, in consultation with an individual who left this company under disciplinary circumstances and has now been brought back in a capacity that has not been approved by this board. My return was authorized by the CEO whose authority. Grant started. You're a maintenance worker, Preston said. Whatever legal arrangement Hartwell has described, you are a maintenance worker who was asked to leave this company for insubordination and has now been brought back because Camille made a personal decision that has clouded her judgment about what is good for this company. The room absorbed this. Grant looked at Preston directly. This was coming. He'd thought about it last night, lying on his back in the dark. Yes, intervened. He'd thought about what Preston would say and what he himself would say back, and he'd gone through it enough times that the fear of it had flattened into something manageable. You're right that I'm a maintenance worker, Grant said. He said, I've been a maintenance worker here for 17 years. Every system in this building at a level that nobody in this room does. I know them because I've spent 17 years fixing them, and more importantly, I've spent 17 years paying attention to them. He paused. You've walked past me in this building for 3 years. I don't think you ever learned my first name. Preston's jaw tightened. You got these reports. Grant gestured toward the screen. 3 of them. You read them. The timestamps show you opened them. And you made a decision about how much weight they deserved, based on who sent them. You saw the title and you stopped reading. He kept his voice level. He wasn't angry. He'd passed through angry somewhere in the past week and come out the other side into something quieter and more useful. That decision nearly killed people, Mrs. Chen. Reuben, Hector, who had to make a split-second call that he shouldn't have needed to make because the correct call should have been made 6 weeks earlier. This is emotional argument, Preston said. It doesn't change the substance. The substance, Grant said, is that you've been receiving payments from Vantage Meridian's principals for 14 months while serving as COO of this company. That's not my argument. That's your bank records. He opened the box. He took out the first document, the maintenance reports, paper clipped together, and placed them on the table. He took out the copier logs, the read receipts, the LLC registration, the payment records, the email metadata, Hector's statement, the county property records, the withdrawn reassessment request, one document at a time. He placed each one on the glass table without rushing. The stack grew. It was, in total, not a large pile, maybe an inch and a half of paper. But each piece landed in the room with the particular weight of things that could not be undismissed. When he was done, he placed his hands on the table and looked at the board. "Everything here is a matter of record," he said. "Public records, company records, employment records. I didn't generate any of this. It was all there. It was just sitting in places where nobody had thought to look because nobody thought the quiet man in the maintenance department was paying attention." He looked at Preston one more time. "He wasn't invisible because he was unimportant. He was invisible because you decided he was." The room was very quiet. Preston's attorney leaned toward him and said something in a low voice. Preston appeared to be listening, but his eyes were moving around the table, reading the board members' faces, doing the calculation that Grant had watched powerful people do when they realized the room had shifted beneath them. It had shifted. Grant could feel it. Not dramatically, there was no single moment where the air changed or someone gasped. It was more like the slow, definitive settling of something that had been held in suspension. The board members were looking at the documents on the table. Halverson had picked up the property record and was reading it. Park had the consulting agreement. Langford was looking at the copier log. Preston made one more attempt. He stood up a physical choice, the choice to take up vertical space and address the board in the tone he used when he was trying to reestablish authority through sheer familiarity. He called three of them by first name. He talked about the acquisition timeline and the financial risk of delay and the jobs that would be protected if the deal closed on schedule. "This is the fundamental issue," he said. "This deal closes and the factory is protected. This deal falls apart and we are looking at a restructuring that nobody in this room wants. I have spent 14 months building toward this moment, and I am telling you, no, as the person who has run the operational side of this company through a difficult period, we cannot afford to let a maintenance grievance and a property dispute derail what is best for this company and its workers." He sat down. Several people were looking at their documents. Park spoke. She was a small woman in her late 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the specific economy of speech that came from decades of not wasting words. "Preston, the consulting agreement, the LLC." She held up the paper. "This is your name. I can explain the structure." "I'm not asking you to explain the structure," she said. "I'm asking you whether you disclosed this arrangement to the board or to the CEO before today." A silence. The arrangement was yes or no, Park said. Silence. "No," Preston said. The room was very quiet again. Halverson set down the property record. He looked at Camille. "What are you recommending?" Camille had been standing at the head of the table through all of it. She'd let Grant speak without interrupting. Let Preston respond without interrupting. Let the board sit with the documents. She straightened slightly. "I'm recommending the immediate suspension of Preston Vale, pending an independent investigation into the consulting arrangement and its relationship to the acquisition process," she said. "I'm recommending we terminate the acquisition agreement with Vantage Meridian on the grounds that the process was materially compromised. And I'm recommending we authorize outside counsel to conduct a full review of the acquisition timeline and provide a report to the board within 60 days. She paused. "I'm also recommending we authorize an independent engineering assessment of Line 41 selected by this board and by management, and that we implement a safety review protocol across all production lines." She looked around the table. "We nearly lost people on that floor. That is not a footnote. Is the first thing we fix." The vote took 11 minutes. 12 in favor of Camille's recommendations. 1 abstention. Halverson, who sat with his hands folded on the table and said, "Abstain," in the voice of a man who had decided he did not know enough to vote either way and was honest enough to say so. 1 absent, a board member who had called in by phone and whose connection cut out during the discussions could not be reestablished. Preston Vale did not vote. He was not a board member. He had no vote. He sat in his chair through the count with a stillness that Grant recognized as the particular stillness of someone whose next move was being calculated somewhere they weren't showing. When it was over, Audra came in from the hallway she'd been waiting outside and served Preston with a formal notice of suspension, which she did quietly and efficiently and without ceremony. Preston took the document, read it, looked up at the room once, and then stood and left without saying anything. His attorney followed him. The door closed. Grant looked at the documents still laid out on the glass table, the stack of 1.5 inches of paper. He thought about how long it had existed in parts, in fragments, across 17 years of maintenance logs and 3 weeks of written warnings and 9 months of an unexplained survey crew and decades of fallow land and 1 letter from a dead man who had decided that the quietest man inside it. The building deserved a stake in what happened to it. He thought about Marcus Waverly, whom he'd known as a man who showed up unannounced on the factory floor and asked genuine questions and listened to the answers. A man who had recognized something in a maintenance worker that most people walked past without seeing, and had built a specific, unusual mechanism to make sure that what he recognized couldn't be erased. If Marcus had imagined, it would be used this way. He suspected Marcus hadn't imagined anything specific, had just understood in the general sense that truth sometimes needed a place to stand. He started gathering the documents from the table. Park stopped beside him. Mr. Calloway. She looked at him steadily. What you did here today, and I mean the original reports, not just today, that took something. It took a maintenance worker knowing what a pressure seal sounds like when it's about to go, Grant said. That too, she looked at him for a moment. Your daughter gets out at 3:15. He looked at her. Camille mentioned it, Park said. The condition you set for coming back. A brief pause. Good condition. She walked away. Langford shook his hand on the way out. 3 other board members nodded. Halverson left without making eye contact with anyone, which Grant thought was honest. The man had nothing to say and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Edmund Hartwell stopped beside Grant on his way to the door. He was pulling on his overcoat, the slow, methodical way of an older man who didn't rush small things. Marcus would have wanted to be here for this, he said. He was here, Grant said, more or less. Hartwell considered that. More or less, he agreed. He buttoned his coat. Call me if you need anything. He left. The room emptied slowly, the way rooms do, after significant things have happened, people needing a moment to recalibrate before they re-entered the hallway and the ordinary world. Eventually, it was just Camille and Grant. She was still standing at the head of the table. She looked, finally, like someone for whom the thing she'd been holding for days had been set down. Relaxed, that wasn't the right word. Released, maybe. Okay, she said quietly, to no one in particular. Grant picked up the cardboard box. He put the documents back in it, in the same order he'd arranged them, and sets up the lid on top. Do the rest of your morning, he said. You have a company to run. She looked at him. And you? I have a production line to fix. He picked up the box. And I need to be out of here by 3. She almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something more complicated than that. Something that carried several things at once. 3 o'clock, she said. Every day. Every day, Grant said. He walked out of the conference room and down the back stairs to the maintenance level, carrying his cardboard box. In the east stairwell, he passed 2 workers from the morning shift going the other way, and they nodded to him, and he nodded back. And nobody said anything, and he went down to the work that was waiting for him. Outside, the sky had gone from overcast to something brighter, dramatically just the ordinary shift of a morning working itself out. The parking lot was full. The factory was running. Through the walls, he could hear the hum of machines that had been running for decades and would keep running. For now, because someone had paid attention. He'd intervened. He set the box down in the maintenance office, hung his jacket on the hook, and picked up the work order clipboard. Line 4, start there. Line 4 took 3 weeks to fix properly. Not because the work was beyond what Grant and his crew could do, but because doing it right meant doing it completely, pulling the entire junction assembly, replacing all 4 primary seals with components rated for the actual operating pressures rather than the original 1,987 specifications, upgrading the pressure monitoring system to real-time digital sensors that logged to a central record nobody could quietly access and edit, and running a full calibration cycle before the line went back into production. Grant refused to sign off on anything less than that, and Camille had made it plain to the interim facilities manager that Grant's sign-off was the only one that counted on line 4 until the independent engineering assessment was complete. The engineering firm the board selected was based out of Atlanta, specialists in heavy industrial systems, with no prior relationship to Redwood Forge or to any entity connected to Vantage Meridian. 2 engineers arrived on a Tuesday morning, spent 4 days in the building, asked Grant more questions than they asked anyone else, and produced a report that largely confirmed what he had written in his 3 warnings, with the addition that several other systems in the facility were also operating closer to their tolerance limits than was advisable, and that a systematic maintenance overhaul was overdue by approximately 3 years. Grant read the report and felt the specific, tired satisfaction of a person who has been saying something for a long time and has finally been formally agreed with. He wrote a response memo outlining a proposed 18-month maintenance schedule. It was the most detailed document he'd ever produced, 42 pages, with system diagrams and cost projections and priority tiers. He wrote it at his kitchen table over 2 weeks, working after Lily went to bed, with a cup of tea going cold beside him, and the house quiet around him. Lily found the printed drafts one morning and asked what they were. He explained. She looked through several pages with the focused attention she gave things that interested her, then said, "This is a lot of words about machines," and handed them back. He said, "Is it important?" "If people follow it, nobody gets hurt," he said. She considered this. "Then it's worth a lot of words," she decided, and went to get her cereal. He submitted the memo to Camille on a Thursday afternoon, which was significant only in that he submitted it at 2:58 and was out the door at 3 on the dot. And he heard later from Daniel that she'd opened it immediately and read it straight through for 4 o'clock meeting and canceled the 4 o'clock to keep reading. She called him that evening. "The HVAC section," she said, without preamble. "You're flagging the North Corridor system as critical priority. It's been running on a bypassed sensor for 14 months. If it fails in summer during a heat event, the temperature on the floor becomes dangerous inside of 2 hours. What's the repair cost? 40,000, maybe 45. A pause, and if we don't fix it, then we find out what it costs when something goes wrong, which is always more." He was at the kitchen sink, rinsing the dinner dishes, the phone wedged between his ear and shoulder. The whole point of the memo is that deferred maintenance is not a savings. It's a debt with interest. "I know," she said. "I know that now." Approving the full schedule. All 18 months. He turned off the faucet. "All of it? My father built this company on the idea that you take care of the thing and the thing takes care of you. I spent my first year here treating the maintenance budget as a variable cost to be optimized." She paused. Was wrong. "I'm not going to keep being wrong about it." He didn't say anything sentimental about that. She didn't need him to, and he wasn't built for it anyway. "I'll have the first quarter work orders ready Monday," he said. Pause. Shorter. "How's Lily?" The question caught him slightly off guard, the way it did every time she asked, because she asked with a genuineness that he hadn't expected from her at the beginning and had stopped being surprised by only recently. "She spelled necessary right on her test this week," he said. "Progress." She was very serious about it. "She sounds like someone else I work with." She hung up. Grant stood at the sink for a moment with the phone in his hand, and then he put it down and finished the dishes. Preston Vale's situation resolved itself over the following months in the way these things do when the documentation is clear and the lawyers are thorough slowly, then all at once. The independent investigation, conducted by outside counsel with access to both the company's records and the financial forensics, Audra's team, had begun, produced a final report 4 months after the board meeting. Consulting everything. It had confirmed the consulting arrangement with Vantage Meridian's principal entities, predating the acquisition discussions by 8 months, the deliberate suppression of Grant's maintenance warnings, the coordination with Vantage Meridian on acquisition timing designed to precede the public announcement of the Meridian Corridor Freight Project, and the withdrawn property reassessment which Preston had arranged through the shell company to prevent the 60-acre parcel's value from becoming discoverable before the sale closed. The report went to the board. The board voted to refer the matter to the State Attorney General's office and to the Securities and Exchange Commission, given that the acquisition had involved publicly registered entities and the undisclosed consulting arrangement potentially constituted securities fraud. Preston resigned from all related positions before the referrals went out, which his attorneys had apparently advised him to do. It didn't help much. The investigation took 11 months. At the end of it, Preston Vale was indicted on 4 counts, including fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud. Yes, he'd intervened. Grant followed the news the way he followed most things steadily, without drama, reading the updates when they appeared, and then going back to whatever he'd been doing. He wasn't satisfied in the way people expected him to be satisfied. He wasn't angry anymore, hadn't been for a while. What he felt, mostly, was a kind of flat acknowledgement. The thing had been wrong. Now it was being addressed. The machinery of consequence was slow and imperfect, and it didn't restore anything, but it moved. He told Lily only that the man who'd caused the problem at work was being held responsible by the legal system. She asked if that meant everything was fixed. He said the factory was fixed. The legal part was a separate thing. She thought about it and said that seemed right, that breaking something and getting in trouble for it were 2 different problems, and it made sense they'd be fixed separately. He looked at her across the dinner table. "You should be a lawyer," he said. "I'm going to be a marine biologist," she said. "But maybe both." The Meridian Corridor Freight Project was publicly announced 16 months after the board meeting. The announcement came on a Wednesday morning in a joint press release from the Freight Consortium and 3 transportation agencies. The project involved a private rail and heavy freight corridor covering a 400-mile route through the region, with a projected economic impact of several $billion over the first decade of operation. The route, confirmed for the first time in the public release, ran directly adjacent to the Redwood Forge East property. Grant read the announcement on his phone in the maintenance office at 7:15 in the morning, before the shift started. He sat with it for a minute. Then he forwarded it to Camille with no comment. She called him 40 seconds later. "I saw," he said. "The preliminary assessment from our real estate consultants came in an hour ago," she said. Her voice had that particular quality it got when she was managing her own reaction to something significant. Conservative estimate on the 60 acres is $62 million. The aggressive estimate is closer to 90. Grant looked out the window of the maintenance office at the production floor. Morning shift was arriving. Reuben was at the tool locker. Mrs. Chen was signing in at the floor station. "The factory is fine," he said. "The factory is fine," she agreed. "More than fine, actually. With the property value and the operational improvements from the past year, we've had 2 legitimate acquisition inquiries in the past month from buyers who actually want to run a manufacturing facility." "What did you tell them?" "That the company is not for sale." She paused. "We don't need to be rescued anymore." He thought about that sentence. He thought about the board meeting 14 months ago, when the whole premise of the acquisition had been that the company needed saving, and the only way to save it was to hand it to someone else. He thought about how much of that story had been constructed by someone who needed the company to believe it was desperate. He said, "We don't." He could hear her breathing on the other end, which meant she was about to say something she'd been working up to. He'd learned to recognize it. "The board wants to formalize your role," she said. "Director of Safety and Operational Integrity. It's a board-appointed position, which means it has actual standing independent of the executive team. You'd have direct reporting rights to the board, not just to me." A pause. And a salary that reflects what you actually do here, not what the maintenance pay scale says you should earn. He was quiet for a moment. "What's the catch?" "No catch. There's a condition from me personally." "What condition?" "You keep doing the work. You don't become someone who manages other people doing the work. You stay on the floor." Another pause. "The board thinks you should have an office on the 4th floor. I told them you'd probably use the maintenance bay office, and they'd never see you up there. They'd see me at board meetings. Quarterly. Quarterly is fine." He looked at the work order clipboard. "What's the salary?" she told him. He was quiet for long enough that she said, "Grant." That's not an insulting number. That's a real number, he said. Just give me a second. He sat with it. The number was, in the plain language of numbers, more than he'd made in the previous 4 years combined. It was the kind of number that changed the arithmetic of a life, not what he spent necessarily, not what he owned, but what he could stop worrying about. The mortgage, the broken furnace he'd been nursing through 2 winters, Lily's college, which was still 10 years away, but which he thought about more than he probably should. He thought about what Marcus Waverly had said to Edmund Hartwell, that the value of the trust wasn't about making Grant wealthy. It was about giving him freedom. Freedom to say what was true, without calculating the cost of saying it. He understood now that the salary was the same thing in different form. I accept, he said. Good, he could hear the relief in it, not performed relief. Actual relief, the kind that meant she'd been worried he'd say no. He found that quietly remarkable. No. Camille Waverly had spent 14 months becoming someone who could be relieved that the quiet man in the maintenance department had said yes to something. He thought Marcus would have found that entirely predictable. I need to get to work, Grant said. I know, 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock, he said, and hung up. The months that followed were not uncomplicated, and that was the honest truth of it. The work was real, and it was hard, and some days it was grinding, in the way that real work always eventually is. There were systems that resisted being fixed. There were workers who resented change to routines they'd built over years. There were meetings with the board, where Grant sat in a chair that still cost more than his monthly mortgage, and said things that not everyone wanted to hear. And he did it because that was the function of his position, and the reason Marcus had created the mechanism that led to his being in it, and because silence in a room full of powerful people had already cost this building more than it could afford. Was not easy to work with, and neither, he suspected, was he. She moved fast and thought several steps ahead, and sometimes made decisions before the ground was as solid as he'd have liked. He said so directly in the plain language that she'd learned to expect from him, and that she'd come to not always love, but trust. She pushed back on his timelines. He held his positions. They argued sometimes, not dramatically, but with the specific friction of 2 people who had different styles and needed the same thing to work. It worked. Not because they were perfectly matched or because the story required them to be. It worked because they were both, underneath the friction, trying to do the same thing. That turned out to be enough. Hector Salazar was promoted to Director of Floor Operations, a new position created as part of the restructuring. He took it with the same quiet, deliberate competence he brought to everything, and became the person on the production side that Grant was on the maintenance side, someone who knew the building from the inside out and whose job it was to say, plainly and without managing the message, what was actually true. The 2 of them had coffee on Tuesday mornings in the break room, the same break room where Hector had sat across from Grant and asked him what he was going to do. You ever think about how close it was? Hector asked. One Tuesday, about 8 months in. Which part? All of it, the line, the deal. You walking out, he wrapped his hands around his cup. 10 minutes on the line. 1 week of you being gone. He paused. Different 10 minutes, different week. And none of this goes the way it went. Grant thought about that. You would have noticed something was wrong eventually. But you're the one who noticed first. He looked at Grant directly. That matters. The noticing first matters. Grant drank his coffee. He didn't have an answer for that, and he'd stopped trying to construct one. The plain fact was that he'd noticed because he'd spent 17 years paying attention to things nobody else thought were worth paying attention to. Yes, he'd, and the reason he'd kept paying attention year after year in a building where his title meant nothing to the people in the glass offices above him was something he'd never been able to fully articulate, some combination of professional stubbornness and the fact that he genuinely could not stand the idea of something breaking that he could have prevented. Elena had called it his best quality and his worst quality simultaneously. She'd said it with the specific affection of someone who had accepted that the person they loved came with certain fixed features. Like hardware, you couldn't update. The way he always missed her, not constantly. Not with the acute pain of the early years, but in the background, a low frequency that surfaced at particular moments. Tuesday morning coffee was sometimes one of those moments. He missed her, and he got up and went back to work. Lily turned 9 in October. The party was 8 kids, a grocery store cake with uneven frost that she'd specifically requested because she didn't trust perfect-looking frosting, a scavenger hunt in the backyard that Grant had designed and that turned out to be slightly too hard, requiring 3 hints before anyone found the final clue. She declared it the best party she'd had, which he suspected was generous but accepted. In the spring, she started a science fair project on hydraulic systems. She'd picked the topic herself, something about water pressure and how it moved through pipes. And Grant had answered her questions with the thoroughness he brought to maintenance reports, which she matched with a seriousness that he found both amusing and moving. She built a small working model using clear plastic tubing and a hand pump, labeled every component, and wrote a conclusion that included the sentence, "If you don't take care of the pressure will take care of itself, and usually not in the way you want." Her teacher wrote in the margin, "Excellent insight." She won second place, which she was briefly annoyed about, until Grant pointed out that the first place project had been built by a kid whose father was an engineer and who had clearly had significant adult assistance, and that her project had been built almost entirely by her. She considered this and decided second place under those conditions was actually better than first. She was very much her mother's daughter in that regard. The letter came on a Friday afternoon in early November, almost exactly 2 years after Grant had closed his laptop in that boardroom and walked out. It was from Lily's school, a notification that the college counseling program for high-achieving students was beginning to collect materials for a preparatory portfolio, and that one component was an early practice essay on a topic of the student's choice. Lily had already written hers. She left it on the kitchen table with a post-it note that said, "Can you read this?" And then, as though she'd reconsidered the vulnerability of asking directly, went to her room before he came home. He read it standing up, still in his jacket, his keys in his hand. It was 2 pages, handwritten on notebook paper in Lily's current handwriting, which was considerably more legible than it had been a year ago. She'd titled it, "Small Things Still Count." She wrote about the day he came home and told her he'd left his job. She vet-teened. She wrote about the question she'd asked him whether leaving was the right thing and his answer, and what it had felt like to believe him. She wrote about the machines he fixed, and about how he'd explained to her once that the difference between a machine that worked and a machine that failed was usually not one catastrophic thing, but many small things that had been left unaddressed. She wrote that she thought people were like that too, and that the work of maintaining something, a machine, a family, a self, was mostly invisible, and most people didn't see it until something broke. Yet, she wrote, "My dad did the right thing before he knew it would work out. He wasn't brave because he was sure. He was brave because he didn't know, and he did it anyway. That's the only kind of brave that counts." She wrote, "He is home every day at 3:15. Is not a small thing. That is the biggest thing." He stood in the kitchen, reading it until his eyes did what they did, briefly, and then he set it down and looked at the ceiling and did the 10 seconds. Exactly 10, he went to her door. "Lily," a pause. "This is really good." A longer pause. "You think?" "I think it's really good." He leaned against the door frame. "You spelled catastrophic, right?" A small sound from inside the room that might have been a laugh. "I looked it up. Good instinct." He went to make dinner. She came out 10 minutes later and sat at the table and did her homework while he cooked, and neither of them said anything about the essay again, because it had been said, and that was enough. 2 years after the board meeting, the Redwood Forge that existed bore a relationship to the one before the crisis without being the same place. The production lines ran at appropriate pressures, monitored by sensors, that logged to systems 3 people had administrative access to, one of whom was Grant. The 18-month maintenance schedule had been completed and renewed for a second cycle. The independent engineering firm now conducted annual assessments as a matter of standard practice, embedded in the company's governance documents as a board requirement that couldn't be quietly discontinued by a COO who had other interests. The 60-acre east parcel had been surveyed, formally assessed, and entered into the company's asset register at its current appraised value, which was $71 million. Camille had declined 2 offers to sell it, both from legitimate buyers this time, on the grounds that the company's strategic position was stronger with the asset retained. the board had agreed. 412 workers were still on the floor. Actually, the company had hired 63 additional people in the past year, as production capacity was restructured and the new maintenance protocols allowed for longer sustained operation without shutdowns. Hector ran a floor that worked because the machines worked, and the machines worked because the people responsible for them were finally resourced to do the job correctly. Preston Vale was convicted on 2 of the 4 original counts. He received a sentence that included substantial fines and a 3-year period of supervised release, along with a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any public company. His attorneys had argued for leniency on the grounds that no physical harm had ultimately resulted from the incident. The judge had noted in her sentencing remarks that this was not because of anything Preston had done, but because a maintenance worker named Grant Calloway had written 3 reports that someone had tried to make disappear. Grant read the sentencing report on his phone in the parking lot at 3:12, waiting for the dismissal bell. He'd envied. He thought about Preston in that boardroom, looking at the maintenance reports the way you'd look at junk mail. He thought about the particular kind of certainty that makes a person incapable of being surprised by what they've missed, the certainty that comes from never having been seriously wrong about what's worth paying attention to. He didn't feel sorry for Preston. He didn't feel triumphant either. Something since he felt something closer to the flat acknowledgement he'd felt before. The thing had been wrong, and now it had been addressed, and the distance between those 2 moments had cost everyone something. And the best thing to do with that cost was to make sure the work it had taken to close the distance wasn't lost. He put his phone in his pocket. The bell rang. The doors opened. Lily came out in a green jacket this year. She'd retired the yellow raincoat sometime in the summer, a transition she hadn't announced, with her backpack fully zipped for once and a book under her arm. She spotted him and crossed the sidewalk and didn't crash into him the way she had when she was 8. She was 10 now, and 10-year-olds managed their momentum differently. She just came up beside him and fell into step. "How was it?" he asked. "Sophie got a hamster," she said. She brought photos. "How's the hamster?" "Objectively cute. I have concerns about its long-term well-being given Sophie's track record with responsibility." "That's a fair concern." They walked to the car. She got in, dropped her bag at her feet, and looked out the window at the other kids crossing the parking lot. Grant started the car. The afternoon was ordinary clear, a little cold, the particular quality of November light that was clean and specific and would be gone in 2 hours. "Dad," Lily said. "Yeah. Do you like your job now? Actually like it?" He thought about the question seriously, because she'd asked it seriously. He thought about the maintenance bay, and the Tuesday coffees, and the board meetings, and the 42-page memo, and Camille's voice on the phone when she was deciding things, and Hector across the break room table, quiet satisfaction of a Sims that ran at the right pressure, and the certainty that if it started to drift, someone would know, and something would be done. He thought about what freedom actually felt like from the inside. The financial version, though, that was real, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. The other kind. The kind where you say what is true because it is true, and the saying of it costs you something, and you say it anyway, and then you live with what happens. He said, "I actually like it." She nodded, satisfied, and opened her book. He drove home. In his office at Redwood Forge, on the wall beside the door, 2 things hung in frames. One was Lily's crayon drawing from when she was 6, the stick figure man with the stick figure tools, labeled in careful child's print, "My Dad Fixes Things." The other was a letter on Hartwell, Driscoll, and Associates letterhead, dated 14 months after Marcus Waverly had died. The letter that had sat in a file for 14 months without being read. The letter that changed everything. Or, more precisely, the letter that had always been there, waiting for the moment when the right people were finally paying attention. The quietest man in the room had been holding everything together the whole time. He'd just needed somewhere to stand.